November 30th, 1917. Dawn breaks over the shattered landscape near Cambrai, France. For 10 days, British tanks have been carving through German defenses in what newspapers back home are calling a miracle. Church bells rang across England for the first time since the war began. Victory seemed within grasp. But on this cold morning, everything is about to collapse. German storm troopers are massing in the mist, artillery shells are screaming overhead, and the British Tank Corps is about to learn the most brutal lesson of the Great War. Within 48 hours, nearly every yard of ground won will be lost. Hundreds of tanks will lie burning in the mud. Thousands of men will be dead or captured. And yet, from this catastrophic defeat will emerge the tactical blueprint that will win the war. This is the story of how Britain's greatest failure became its ultimate triumph. The Cambrai offensive had begun with such promise. November 20th, 1917. 378 tanks rolled forward without the usual days of preliminary bombardment that always warned the Germans an attack was coming. The ground was firm, not the usual Flanders mud. The tanks crushed through barbed wire, crossed trenches on massive bundles of wood called fascines, and punched a hole 4 miles deep into the Hindenburg Line. It was the first time in 3 years of grinding attrition that anyone had broken through German defenses so quickly. Brigadier General Hugh Ells, commander of the Tank Corps, rode into battle in a tank himself, leading from the front. His flag flew from the top of the vehicle as machine gun bullets pinged off the armor. For a moment, it seemed like the future of warfare had arrived, but there was a problem, a massive, fundamental problem that nobody in the British High Command had properly thought through. What happens after the tanks break through? The infantry couldn't keep up with the armored advance. The artillery was still miles behind, unable to provide supporting fire. The cavalry, which was supposed to exploit the breakthrough, found itself tangled in old trenches and wire. The tanks themselves, mechanical beasts that broke down constantly, began to fail. By November 23rd, only about 90 tanks were still operational. The rest had been knocked out by German artillery, ditched in trenches, or simply broken down from mechanical failure. And the British had no reserves, no plan for what came next. They had won the battle but had no idea how to win the campaign. Major John Frederick Charles Fuller sat in a cramped headquarters room, studying maps and reports. At 39 years old, Fuller was the chief staff officer of the Tank Corps, a brilliant, abrasive intellectual who believed tanks would revolutionize warfare. He had helped plan the Cambrai attack, convinced that massed armor could succeed where infantry assaults had failed for 3 years. Now, as reports flooded in of German counterattacks, he felt the weight of impending disaster. Fuller had a sharp mind and an even sharper tongue. He had written extensively about military theory, often criticizing the hidebound thinking of senior generals. But theory was about to meet reality in the most painful way possible. November 30th arrived like a hammer blow. German General Georg von der Marwitz had spent the previous week carefully preparing a counteroffensive. Unlike the British, the Germans had learned from their own failures. They had developed new tactics, stormtrooper units trained to infiltrate weak points, bypass strong ones, and cause chaos behind enemy lines. They had brought up massive amounts of artillery, and they had studied where the British were weakest. At 7 a.m., German guns opened fire. Not the usual random shelling, but carefully targeted barrages hitting British artillery positions, headquarters, and communication lines. Then came the storm troopers, moving fast through morning fog, avoiding British strong points, flowing around resistance like water. Captain Arthur Behrend, a British artillery officer, was eating breakfast when the barrage started. The first shells landed so close that the blast wave knocked him off his chair. Outside, the world had become a nightmare of smoke, flame, and screaming metal. His battery tried to return fire, but they couldn't see targets through the fog. German infantry were already infiltrating past them. Behrend watched in horror as his guns were overrun. Men who had survived years in the trenches were killed or captured in minutes. The carefully planned British positions, which had seemed so secure just hours before, were collapsing. By noon, German forces had recaptured almost everything the British had taken in 10 days of fighting. The great tank victory had become a humiliating defeat. The casualties were staggering. British forces lost nearly 45,000 men in the German counterattack, almost as many as they had lost in the initial offensive. Worse, they lost over 100 tanks, either destroyed or captured. The psychological impact was devastating. After the initial success at Cambrai, expectations had soared. Now, those hopes lay shattered in the mud. In London, the government faced angry questions. How had victory turned to defeat so quickly? Who was responsible? The Tank Corps, which had been celebrated just days before, now faced an uncertain future. Some senior officers argued that tanks had been proven a failure, that the money and resources should go back to traditional infantry and artillery. The future of armored warfare hung in the balance. But Fuller refused to accept that tanks were the problem. In his headquarters, surrounded by reports and maps, he began a systematic analysis of what had gone wrong. He worked obsessively, often through the night, filling notebooks with observations and calculations. The problem, he concluded, wasn't the tanks themselves. It was how they had been used. The British had thought of tanks as a breakthrough weapon, a way to smash through enemy lines. But they had failed to think about what came next. There was no coordination between tanks, infantry, artillery, and aircraft. Each arm of the military had operated independently, without a unified plan. The tanks had advanced, but the infantry couldn't keep up. The artillery had stayed behind, unable to support the advance. The cavalry had been useless in the churned-up battlefield, and there were no reserves to exploit success or respond to German counterattacks. Fuller began writing. He produced report after report, analyzing every aspect of the Cambrai battle. He interviewed tank commanders, infantry officers, and artillery spotters. He studied German tactics, trying to understand how they had achieved such devastating success in their counterattack. And slowly, a new vision began to emerge. What if all the different arms of the military could be coordinated? What if tanks, infantry, artillery, and aircraft all worked together as a single system? What if attacks were planned not just to break through enemy lines, but to completely disrupt the enemy's ability to respond? This wasn't just about tanks. This was about a completely new way of fighting. Fuller wasn't alone in this thinking. Other officers were also analyzing the Cambrai failure. Lieutenant Colonel Ernest Swinton, one of the original advocates for tanks, was pushing for better coordination between different military branches. Brigadier General Tudor, an artillery commander, was experimenting with new techniques for supporting advancing infantry. And across the British Army, younger officers who had grown up in the trenches were questioning the old ways of doing things. The massive casualties of the Somme and Passchendaele had shown that simply throwing men at machine guns didn't work. There had to be a better way. By early 1918, Fuller had developed what he called the Plan 1919. It was a comprehensive blueprint for how to win the war using coordinated combined arms tactics. Tanks would lead the assault, breaking through enemy defenses. But unlike at Cambrai, they would be closely followed by infantry trained to work with armor. Artillery would provide a creeping barrage, a moving wall of explosions just ahead of the advancing troops. Aircraft would bomb enemy headquarters and artillery positions, disrupting command and control. And there would be reserves, mobile forces ready to exploit any breakthrough. The goal wasn't just to capture ground, but to paralyze the enemy's ability to respond. Fuller called it disorganization of the enemy. Modern military theorists would later call it maneuver warfare. But theory had to be tested in practice. And by spring 1918, the British Army was fighting for survival. In March, Germany launched Operation Michael, a massive offensive using their own storm trooper tactics. British forces fell back, losing in weeks what had taken years to capture. It was a desperate time. The Germans seemed on the verge of winning the war, but by August the situation had changed. American troops were arriving in large numbers. German forces were exhausted from their spring offensives, and the British had been training, preparing, incorporating the lessons learned from Cambrai. Fuller's ideas were about to be put to the ultimate test. August 8, 1918. The town of Amiens in northern France. Before dawn, 456 British and French tanks moved into position. This was a larger tank force than had attacked at Cambrai, but this time everything was different. The tanks were organized into battalions, each working with specific infantry units. The infantry had been trained in new tactics, learning how to advance behind tanks, how to consolidate captured positions, how to deal with German counterattacks. The artillery had prepared detailed fire plans, with creeping barrages timed to move forward at exactly the same pace as the advancing troops. Above, the Royal Air Force had assembled over 800 aircraft, ready to bomb, strafe, and scout. And behind the front lines, cavalry and mobile reserves waited to exploit any breakthrough. This wasn't just an attack. This was a symphony of destruction, every element coordinated to the minute. There was no preliminary bombardment. That had been the mistake at the Somme, at Passchendaele, even partially at Cambrai. Days of shelling always warned the Germans that an attack was coming. This time, the British would achieve complete surprise. At 4:20 a.m., as fog rolled across the battlefield, the tanks moved forward. Seconds later, over 2,000 guns opened fire simultaneously. The creeping barrage began, shells exploding in a precise line just ahead of the advancing armor. German soldiers in their trenches had no warning. One moment all was quiet. The next the world exploded. Tanks emerged from the fog like prehistoric monsters, machine guns chattering, crushing wire and trenches. Behind them came waves of infantry, moving fast, not stopping to fight every German position but bypassing strong points and pushing forward. Sergeant Harold Whitfield of the 8th Battalion, Tank Corps, was commanding a Mark V tank named Firefly. As his tank rumbled forward through the fog, he could hear German machine gun bullets pinging off the armor. Inside, the noise was deafening, the heat oppressive, the fumes from the engine choking. But Whitfield had trained for this. His crew knew their jobs. The gunners fired at German positions, the driver navigated around shell holes, and Whitfield coordinated with the infantry following behind. They crossed the first German trench line within minutes. Usually, that would take hours or days of fighting. Now, they were through before the Germans could even organize a defense. Whitfield's tank pushed on, crushing wire, destroying machine gun nests, spreading panic. The German defenders were completely overwhelmed. Their artillery had been targeted by British counter-battery fire and couldn't respond. Their communication lines had been cut by the initial barrage. Stormtrooper tactics that had worked so well in the spring were useless against this coordinated assault. German officers tried to organize counterattacks, but British aircraft strafed any concentrations of troops. Reserves trying to move up were bombed and scattered. The entire German defensive system, which had held for years, was collapsing. By mid-morning, British forces had advanced over 3 miles. By afternoon, they had gone 5 miles. By the end of the day, they had pushed 8 miles into German territory, capturing over 15,000 prisoners and 400 guns. It was the greatest single-day advance by any army on the Western Front since 1914. General Erich Ludendorff, the German commander, later called August 8th the Black Day of the German Army. It wasn't just the territory lost or the casualties. It was the psychological impact. For 4 years, the German army had believed it was invincible in defense. Now, that confidence was shattered. Ludendorff realized that Germany could no longer win the war. The Amiens offensive proved that the Allies had solved the problem of trench warfare. They had found a way to break through defenses and keep advancing. And it was all based on the lessons learned from the failure at Cambrai 9 months earlier. Fuller watched the reports come in from Amiens with satisfaction. His theories had worked. Combined arms coordination, surprise, and deep penetration had achieved what years of attritional warfare could not. But he knew this was just the beginning. Over the next 3 months, British forces would launch a series of coordinated offensives, each using the same principles tested at Amiens. The Germans called it the 100 Days Offensive. British and Allied forces advanced steadily, breaking through one defensive line after another. The German army, which had seemed so formidable just months before, was crumbling. By November, Germany would ask for an armistice. The war would be over. The transformation from Cambrai to Amiens was remarkable. In November 1917, the British had achieved initial success, but had no plan for exploitation, no coordination between different military branches, and no understanding of how to sustain an offensive. By August 1918, they had developed a sophisticated system of combined arms warfare that would become the foundation for modern military doctrine. Tanks, infantry, artillery, and aircraft all worked together as a single coordinated force. Surprise and speed replaced the grinding attrition of earlier years. And most importantly, the British had learned to learn from failure. Instead of blaming tanks for the Cambrai defeat, officers like Fuller had analyzed what went wrong and developed solutions. The impact of this innovation extended far beyond World War I. The combined arms doctrine developed between Cambrai and Amiens would influence military thinking for the next century. In World War II, German blitzkrieg tactics were based on similar principles of coordination between armor, infantry, artillery, and air power. Modern militaries still use the concept of combined arms, coordinating different capabilities to achieve overwhelming force at a decisive point. The lessons learned from Cambrai's failure and Amiens' success remain relevant today. Innovation often comes from honest analysis of defeat. The British could have blamed tanks, blamed commanders, blamed bad luck. Instead, they systematically studied what went wrong and developed solutions. Fuller would go on to become one of the most influential military theorists of the 20th century. His writings on armored warfare and combined arms tactics would be studied by officers around the world. He would become known as the father of tank warfare. though he always insisted that tanks were just one part of a larger system. His ideas about rapid, coordinated offensives designed to disrupt enemy command and control would influence everything from German blitzkrieg to modern maneuver warfare. And it all started with the failure at Cambrai, with the willingness to honestly analyze what went wrong and develop better solutions. The story of Cambrai and Amiens is ultimately about resilience and adaptation. The British Tank Corps faced catastrophic failure in November 1917. They could have been disbanded, their ideas discredited. Instead, they learned, adapted, and came back stronger. They proved that military innovation isn't about having the best technology or the most resources. It's about learning from mistakes, coordinating different capabilities, and constantly adapting to changing circumstances. The church bells that rang prematurely after Cambrai's initial success would ring again in November 1918, this time for real victory. And that victory was built on the lessons learned from defeat, on the willingness to question assumptions, and on the courage to try new approaches even after failure. From the mud and blood of Cambrai emerged the tactical revolution that won the war and shaped modern warfare forever.